Okay, so I just want to say hello and welcome to everyone who's here, whether you're joining us live or watching the recording. Um, we're we're glad that you're here. We're grateful for the important work that you do in supporting birthing families and grieving families through their losses. And we know how important it is for you to care for yourself and to, understand that what we talked about last time was a lot about compassion fatigue and burnout and secondary trauma. Like these are things that are going to happen. It's not if they happen, it's when they happen. And we really need to look at how do we set systems in place for ourselves and take care of ourselves in order to, right, like fill our cup so that we can serve and take care of other people. So I I did not introduce my name. I'm Kylie Hanish, and I'm the founder of Return to Zero Hope. I'm an occupational therapist by training, and I also experienced my own loss of my son Norbert in 2005. He was stillborn at 35 weeks. So I'm excited to put on this webinar series and so grateful for Jodie for joining me again today. If you missed part one, you can watch it in the webinar shop, which we did a couple months ago, but you don't have to have watched that before you watch this one. So I will let Jodie take it from here.
Thanks, Kylie. One question in the chat is part one, can we share the link and or should we just direct them to somewhere? You got it.
Yeah, sure. I'll put it in the chat box right now.
Okay. Um, thanks. So let's see if we can move forward. So just a little bit on the goals of this conversation. I do have slides and some information to kind of move off of, but I'm really hoping that we can have a more informal conversation of just like how to support providers moving through secondary trauma and their own triggers. A couple things that came out of the last conversation that was interested in learning more about was the helper's career and kind of what that looks like based on research that we've found, discussions around boundaries. And I think including in that, I like to frame it as also within our ecosystem and making sure we're working within our scope and that there are other people in the ecosystem. So it isn't just all on one person to do all of the things. And then lastly, one thing that I kind of felt important to throw in here was understanding the resilience of families that we serve, understanding that there is post-traumatic growth and there is this idea of forward motion, whatever that looks like. And so what families don't necessarily need is pity, and they don't need this othering of like this is their terrible story, this is their sad story, and this how do we kind of bring it all together to acknowledge that they're in this place of human suffering, which is a totally normal experience based on this very unnormal thing that happened, even though we can look at research and argue it happens more frequently than we like to imagine in our society. But also that while we are supporting them through that, there is growth and there is healing and recovery on the other end. And there is this ability to see the world in a different perspective. And so I always think it's really important as providers that we keep that light in mind, that we do have the ability to come out of this fire and do something else and bring water to other people. I enjoy that saying. Okay, so a little bit about me. This is me. Um, I am a licensed professional counselor. I'm a trauma and grief therapist by training. I'm certified in perinatal loss care. I'm also certified in perinatal mental health care therapy. I am a bereaved mother, and I've also had 2 subsequent traumatic pregnancies after that. And so when I'm talking through this, I'm usually talking through the lens of grief and trauma, and I tend to use those words interchangeably. And so primarily who I work with outside of providers, whether it's clinicians that I'm supervising or providers within hospital systems and nurses and whoever you are out there in the ether that I'm talking to. I also support families navigating pregnancy loss and subsequent childbirths, and what that looks like, or birth trauma and subsequent childbirth after birth trauma. So that's a little bit about me. So when I'm talking, I am coming from the frame of a trauma and grief therapist and working with that lens, but I'm also a bereaved mother, and I'm also a mother that has had 2 objectively traumatic births after that loss. So I kind of come from that lens as well, of what I would want people to know that are working with families that are experiencing this, from that place. Okay, so the first thing that Kylie mentioned, is the idea of the helping profession. So I just put this quote on there, and then we can kind of move into whatever conversation we want. But this is the idea with the helping profession of: the price one pays of pursuing any profession or calling is an intimate knowledge of its ugly side. So this is a review from the first training that I felt important to kind of put on there. As helpers, we often get into this helping field simply because we're good at it, right? We probably learned really young that, you're really good at listening, and you're really good at caring for people, and you're really good at helping. Whether that's friends on the playground that are struggling, right? You have a lot of empathy. You can show up for people. You can support them through. Whether that's family dynamics, always caring for siblings, or nieces or nephews or whatever, like, you always stepped up to help. And a lot of our profession is females. And so it's understanding that part of our profession, the way that we pick it, might also be equipped, simply because that was what was reinforced, because we were good at it. Right? If we were reinforced at digging in the mud and science, maybe we would have picked a different profession or something else, that didn't involve helping other humans, but instead we got really good and we perfected our gift of helping other people. And so when we talk about stages of helping career, this could be nursing, it could be counseling, it could be OT, it could be social work, it could be doula work, it could be anything that your profession, what you are paid to do, or what you should be paid to do, but you aren't because our society doesn't pay you to do it, is to help another person. And so stage 1 is usually that we're really excited and we're determined, right? We are going to change the world. We are going to make impact. We're going to save everyone, and suffering is going to be obsolete, and everything is going to be great. In this case, when people get into the helping profession around perinatal loss, it's usually we're going to prevent all losses. And then stage 2, we become angry and resentful, because we realize that we can't save everyone. We realize that suffering is a human condition. We realize that suffering is often at the hands of other people and other providers, and we get really angry and resentful. But we then also get angry at families, because why didn't they do the things that they needed to do to make the thing not happen? And then stage 3 is we become depressed and really sad and kind of inward on ourselves, and maybe we ruminate, but we just don't have energy and we don't have drive. And so most of us alternate between stage 2 and 3 frequently, and maybe for years we're in those 2 stages, just back and forth, back and forth. Stage 4 is getting to this point where we understand our place in the ecosystem and we're supporting one family at a time. The goal is to get there. The goal is to understand what we can do, what we are capable of doing, what our limits are, and really understanding ourselves on this journey so that we can move through the anger, resentment, and depression phase to move to stage 4. It doesn't mean you're not going to go back there, right? It doesn't mean just because you hit stage 4, you're never going to go back to angry and depressed, but it means you're on this journey longer. Because what happens is we hit burnout, and then people leave the profession for one reason or another because they don't ever get to stage 4.
Well, in Jodie, I think one thing that's interesting is that okay, in my profession, I was never taught anything about this.
I
And
don't
so
think
I mean, do you think are people taught about this? Like when they're going through their training? No.
no, I didn't learn this in school. I learned this well after the fact. For me, I stopped working with kids. Like when I started getting in this profession, I worked with trauma and loss, but it was with youth and adolescents. And ultimately, after I had my own loss, I realized like I can't separate this anymore. I want to bring all these kids home, and I want to save them, and I want them to live in my attic with me. And that's not healthy. So I realized that I probably shouldn't be working with adolescents anymore. But it was mostly my own stuff, right?
Yeah.
After the loss. But sorry, I cut you off, Kylie. What was your
No, I was just
part
saying,
there?
like, understanding that there are stages and that the goal is, right, we're helping one family at a time, and that we can't change everyone, and we can't change the world how we all come into this, and that you're not a failure if you can't change the world.
Yeah.
Like you can still impact people even if it's in small ways. You can positively impact in small ways, and it's just kind of, it's not all or nothing is what I'm saying.
Mhm.
But I think that if we're not talking about that and normalizing that, then we think that we're failures.
Right. Right. And or we think everyone else is failing also, right? It's that like
Yeah,
no one else is doing their part. Why is it all me? Why am I doing all these things? Why is no one else doing anything? Um,
there's some. Do you want me to read the chats to you? So like Michelle is saying, as an L&D nurse, I don't remember learning about grieving with loss in the workplace. Yeah.
yeah.
Teresa is like, this is more where my anger, resentful comes in to my industry, to the lack of people willing, able to help and care in this capacity. But now this is my place in the ecosystem, I'm recently realizing. And Barbara said, I learned this only after I became burned out and left the profession. Yeah.
Yeah. And some people call it the moral dilemma. I can't think of who the one person is, but this idea that we get into these professions to help people and to save people, and then we see these things that are almost like they're inhumane sometimes, or they're immoral, specifically within labor and delivery. When we get to that dark side where paternalism and oppression and racism and all that come into play, and labor and delivery nurses, I've heard time again, they just feel so helpless, or doulas, they feel so helpless because they come in and they want to support these families and they want to stand side by side, but they're seeing, whether we want to call it abuse or microaggressions or whatever it is, happen on the other end, and then they feel helpless and they're watching that happen. Or they feel like, they're running through their mind on all of the things they could have done to make a different outcome. And sometimes that doesn't work. And specifically when we're talking about baby loss or stillbirth or neonatal death, we come into this profession to save babies and to save moms. And then that happens. And there needs to be reflection to say, is there something that could have happened? But also we need to acknowledge that maybe we need to release some of that and give ourselves permission to grieve and move through that, so that we can then on the other side with the next family not go into hyperdrive, where our trauma is kind of kicking in. I don't know if that makes sense. I think it does though.
Yes.
And so here are a couple what are the root causes, themes, ideas around compassion fatigue. Again, we talked last time about the label of compassion fatigue, burnout, moral wound, or secondary traumatic stress. That's the language I prefer to use, but this is what this research quoted, which the research is from Figley, but this is how he quotes it. Some root causes is that we place needs of others before our own. We sometimes have our own unresolved trauma or pain. We lack healthy professional or personal coping skills. We lack some self-awareness. We give care to others under stress and burnout. So we are already stressed, we're already at our limits, and now we're still caring for others and taking on more stimuli, more going through. We lack some boundaries. We don't have the ability to communicate our needs, and we have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility. So those are some key ideas there. And anytime that I'm talking about like themes or beliefs or roots, as a therapist, I'm always looking at thinking of this idea of reflecting and without judgment and with curiosity and with compassion, kind of wondering, like, are any of these things that we're placed on? Because when we look at these with judgment, then we get defensive, and then we get down on ourselves, and then we like blame ourselves, and we feel like failure, right? We go into that cycle again. And so the encouragement there is to kind of say, like, do any of these fit? And let's just be curious about them. And then let's be curious, like, where that idea came from, and curious, like, why do I feel this overdeveloped sense of responsibility? What is happening there? And on a very personal level, I did have this overdeveloped sense of responsibility when I came into the perinatal mental health field after losing my daughter, May. And part of it, you know, my drive was that I didn't want anyone to feel alone as I did when I went through that. And my trigger though became when helpers didn't help, whatever that meant. It could be therapists, it could be social workers, it could be doctors, and so that became my like thing that I would get really angry and pissed off about, is when like I noticed that helpers weren't helping or helpers caused harm. And for me, it took work to just recognize that, like, that's because I have this overdeveloped sense of responsibility that I want to save all people that have experienced perinatal loss, but also that's not possible. And instead, how can I step back and say, like, what can I do versus what can I do? I can't save everyone. And I can't help every person that's experienced a perinatal loss not feel alone, even though I would love to. And I can't make it so every person experienced perinatal loss doesn't have harm done by a helper. But there's things within that that kind of build on each other. And I'm sharing that only to say, like, we can be super aware of all of these things, and yet they still come up. And the more important part is just recognizing it, right? We need to recognize our triggers, our stuff that makes us react, our feelings, and we need to figure out how to move through that and where that's coming from. I mean, my therapist would gladly trace that back to some childhood place of responsibility and whatever, right? She could easily tell us where that comes from. But it's about just kind of recognizing, like, that's just is a thing that I do. And now I can look at it and kind of check back and be like, that's not mine to hold, and relinquish it instead of ruminating over it and fixating on it and being angry about it and whatever else the situation might be.
So how do you let things go? Like, if I mean, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not mine. Okay. And but for you and for others, like, what are some strategies when we can recognize that? First, we have to recognize it.
Right. First, you have to really get to know yourself. And okay, so I'm going to tell a little story because this literally just happened yesterday. No, 2 days ago. But I was navigating supervision with a clinician that I work with, and they had an event that happened the week before, and they were still kind of hanging on to it, and they're a newer clinician, and so like we're kind of leaning into this and what it is, and it was something with domestic violence, so it's not at all related to perinatal loss. But their initial reaction when they got this trigger of this thing happening was to reach out to me, to reach out to like everyone they knew, to be like, what do I do? And then they reached out to the person, was like, I can call you right now. And then they did this like over engagement of like, how do I support them, how do I do this, how, like, what's going on? And when they finally talked to the person was fine. Like, they were activated, but they were safe, they were okay. They weren't, the clinician was probably more activated than the client. And so in talking this through with the clinician, it's really kind of leaning into, okay, the goal is for us to understand our triggers. Like, how do we respond? Do we go into hyperdrive? Do we go into fix it? Is there the sense of urgency, the sense of like, I must do this now? And when we feel that, that's a cue to us that like there's some secondary trauma happening, something's going on, we're activated, our nervous system's freaking out. And taking a step back and just kind of breathing through it and then saying like, okay, what do I need? Because I'm reacting this way now, and calming our body in that space, but then giving it space to reflect and say, why am I doing this? Why is this situation more reactive to me than even the person it's happening to? In terms of perinatal loss, it would be what specific families that you've worked with hang with you? Do you ruminate well after? And think about the situation and think about how things could have been different and think, and like when you are at that place where you're ruminating, let's go in and explore those themes and the beliefs around that situation. What is happening there? Because it's usually the beliefs and the themes that are keeping us stuck. And so for this specific person, just kind of processing it through and talking to, but for this clinician, this was the first time she probably had some secondary trauma within her helping career, right? She's a young clinician. It was more about acknowledging like, okay, this is number one, right? You fall off the bike the first time, let's figure out what to do, and let's like figure out how to do it differently moving forward. But also this is going to continue to happen because this is part of being in a helping profession. Secondary trauma is going to happen. It's a sidecar of the profession. And so how do we get better at recognizing it, tuning into ourselves and saying, what do I need, regulating through it, and then kind of, pulling apart and reflecting and processing, integrating. That's the therapy word I would use. The events, and figure out where are they coming from and what do I want to do? How do I want to respond differently? Right? Because when we go from reaction, when we can take a few breaths and give ourselves a moment, we can then respond and kind of breathe through it and move through it. And so for this, the letting it go for me is you probably need to process it, and you probably need, in that processing could be talking to another person, it could be journaling, it could be meditating, it could be going for a run. And if it's sticking with you, it's kind of exploring like, why is this sticking with me? It's not that you're stuck in it, it's that it's sticking on you because we haven't necessarily figured out what do we need to grieve through? What do we need to move through yet? And it's basically, the world saying you can't just avoid this any longer. We're going to stick on you.
And I also what came to my mind, I just read the book Burnout by the Hnatkovich sisters. So I highly recommend this. It's called Burnout, the Secrets to Unlocking the Stress or Completing the Stress Cycle, something like that. But basically how we have to process the stress in our bodies, and the main way we have to do this through physical. So when you said like running or going for a walk or something like that, like that's what triggered it for me. But she has meaning Brene Brown, I think on Unlocking Us podcast does a episode with Emily and Amelia Nagoski, and then you can listen to that, and then there's a book. I think that, again, more information and knowledge about yourself and what you can do to kind of process things this way. A lot of the stuff is through physical ways in this instance, but
yeah. And it's about nurturing yourself. It's not like physical, like go to the gym and like, beat yourself up. It's about like nurturing yourself and saying, what do I need? How do I move through this? Yeah. And there's this somatic piece that Peter Levine often talks about with trauma, and how we have to give ourselves space to move through it because we often stop the trauma cycle. And so what we need is to move through the cycle. And often to do that, we need an empathetic witness. So we need someone that's present, but we need to give ourselves permission to just feel all the things and move through it. But we often stop it. And in our medical system, right, labor and delivery nurses, OBs, you're literally trained to stop it. You're trained through your schooling to be like, nope, I'm here, I'm present, we're doing this thing right now. But you're not trained in how to come back because the trauma still happened. You're just trained to shut it down, to lean into work. But how do you then give yourself space and time to go back and process those events, whether it's through running or, but thinking about it and giving it space instead of just being like, I don't want to think about that. I don't want to think about that. I don't want to think about that. Right. And it just keeps coming. That doesn't work. Avoidance only works for so long. And it's a great coping skill, but it's just a coping skill. You need to go back and do the work at some point. So I had like a little snippet in the book to read on other directedness, but this was one that I think talks to the ecosystem and kind of talks to boundaries. And the story in the book, it was about people that adopt, like save animals, and like they, you know, ended up with 35 cats and so many dogs and all of this stuff, and they had to save all the strays that were happening, and they had to keep doing all this stuff, and they weren't paying their mortgage. They were about to lose their house because they could barely afford to pay to feed the cats, let alone all the other stuff that was happening. And they had come to a compassion fatigue class, and they were like, we don't know what to do because if we lose our house, what's going to happen to the cats? And the, like, that's an extreme version, right? But it was this idea that you're so focused on something outside of yourself and taking care of something outside of yourself that you're not taking care of yourself at all. Like, if you lose your house, what's going to happen to the cats? Great, but what's going to happen to you? Right? And so it's a big picture and a pretty extreme scenario, but we might all be able to pick parts from that, of times that we've given ourselves to support someone else, but we need to check back in and say, who's going to take care of us and how do we take care of us? Because if you give everything at work and you're there and you give all of your emotional capacity and all of that, but you don't ever recharge, because then you come home and you have to take care of the kids, but you're not really taking care of the kids because you're short with the kids and you're pissed off at your partner and whatever else is happening, and then you don't even have time to connect with yourself because you have to do all those things and then go to sleep. Is it worth it, is the question there. And how, like, you know, how do you take time to say, I can give to other people, but I'm going to reserve some of this for me? And what does that look like? In grief, often what that looks like is a giant halt for all of the things around you to just lean in to yourself and your body and what that is and how you take care of that.
Yeah, this is really important because, right, we have the tendency to want to help. I mean, I have that tendency also, like want to help, and then you don't realize it until you're suffering yourself. And so
Right.
it's like
And
incorporating.
you're good at helping, Kylie. I mean, like, that's the other reality. You're like, you're good at it. And so there's this like, but I'm good at this, so I should do it all the time, but not when it doesn't support you and your family and what you need in order for your healing and your recovery. Because ultimately what happens is good providers leave the profession because they're burnout. And what we want is for good providers to stay in the profession for, you know, their 35 years until retirement and take it slowly, because you're supporting many more families when you can take breaks and when you can take time for yourself and when you're there for 35 years than when you're there for 5 years and then you're unable to really support anyone and still pissed off about that experience.
But I also,
So
I find,
if we need to be other directed, we need to reframe.
well, I was just going to say that we live in a world where there can be shame around setting boundaries and taking care of yourself, right? Like, oh, they're being selfish and they're not being a team player, that kind of stuff. I mean,
and that is called gaslighting and toxic environments. But right, there's a fine line between selfless and selfish. And we don't want you to be selfless, right? We want you to show up in the capacity, but set limits, right? Like, what does that look like?
So that moves
Yeah.
us for our next topic of boundaries.
Yes. The next topic.
I
Oh,
think.
so caregiving,
Oh,
motive. We don't need to go into that, but it was basically like, checking in with yourself of why you do what you do. And just be cautious of that. Because helping is other directed, but it's also because it feels good to us and it gives us a purpose and it helps us feel worthy and it helps us avoid the shame of not doing enough, right? And so it's just kind of checking in and understanding, like, why am I doing this and what's going on? Okay. And here's another thing. Um, for anyone that's curious, like where you're at, this is the professional quality of life scale. You can go on and do it for free, and it just kind of will help you figure out what's going on. Camilla, do midwife students in the US get any training in meeting bereaved parents delivering a dead baby in Sweden? It's very little, if any. You're supposed to learn while you're working without any preparation. Not many. I have attended some midwife classes and trainings in Pittsburgh to support the midwives in training on like how to show up in that space and what is important to talk to families about. But that was because the professor knew me and pulled me in. But I don't think it's typically a part of the curriculum. I don't know if Kylie has other thoughts there, but I don't think it is.
I'm not aware of in most professions that it's included.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't really make sense. I don't think it's included in most professional trainings, like basic training.
Right. Okay. It's not typically part of it. Not for doula training. Teresa, one thing, so I'm trained as a bereavement doula, but I've never actually attended a bereavement birth. I feel like that's something I'll probably do when I retire and my kids don't need me. But I think for doula trainings, attending a bereavement training is really beneficial to like just support you and kind of let you know some of what's going on and some options. That's just kind of my thought on that. Okay, boundaries. What is my role? Who else can help? What are your thoughts on this? Okay.
Well, I mean, I think we were talking earlier about setting boundaries. Defining boundaries are a part of self-care, right? It's part of how we're going to be able to take care of ourselves in order to give and take care of others. But and I was saying earlier that, like, how do we know what our boundaries are, right? Like, I think it's one thing to say, like, we need to set boundaries, but what does that mean in actuality? And I think that, like, practical advice on, like, what does that mean and how do we determine what our boundaries are? And a lot of it's going to be through trial and error, but there has to be reflection about it.
Yeah, I think that point that it is trial and error. Like we're going to fail over and over and over again. For me, a boundary has always come up when, do I feel resentful while I'm doing a thing or after I'm doing a thing? And if I am, it usually means I didn't set boundaries that I needed. If that makes sense. And so, and it could be most people it's resentful at their employer, and not typically families per se. But it's kind of this like, when are the times that you're working and when are the times that you're willing to work and how many calls are you willing to take outside of working? And just like, what are you willing to do? And what are you willing to do and acknowledge you're doing it and you're not doing something that is for yourself? Whether that's, playing on the floor with your kid or going for a hike or going for a run, like you're doing these things instead of taking care of yourself, instead of doing something that you enjoy. Let's not even call it taking care of, like something you enjoy, going on the canoe, right? Like what is something that while you're doing it, you're thinking, I could have been doing that right now, and that's what I want to be doing. And we all have to work, right? Our certain jobs at our certain times, but there's this like outside of that, what are you doing and how do you make that work? Are you spending a lot of time thinking about what happened at work? If you are, that probably means you need to put more time in your workday to process or kind of move through whatever it is that you're experiencing. If as for clinicians, there's always that like the situation I was talking about earlier, like they immediately stopped what they were doing. They called this person, like, I can talk to you now if you want. And the person's like, no, I'm all right. Um, there's this like also being able to understand, is it a crisis and is it urgent? Or does it feel urgent to me, but it's not necessarily urgent to them? Does it feel, or vice versa, right? Perinatal loss in general is an emotional crisis, but it's not a medical crisis. And so for us on the helping end, we need to figure out like where do we play through that. Usually the medical crisis has already happened, right? And it's not a medical crisis. Sometimes it is. I realized as I said that someone's going to be like, but there's this one time we need to make sure the mom's healthy, which is true. But usually the medical crisis has passed and now it's an emotional crisis while they're waiting to deliver or whatever else is happening. And so how do we lean in and how do we check that? For some nurses, I've heard that the boundary is about other families or other nurses wanting to take breaks or other doctors needing to go do something and them not being with the family they want to be with and with another family because someone had a desire to do something else, not because it was their job, but because someone just asked them to do it and they said they would. Like, well, set that boundary and be like, no, I think I really need to be with this family right now. And it could just be like hanging out in the room with them, which is okay. For a bereaved family, that is usually fine because that's the support that they need in that moment. And so I guess for the question for me is always, it's individual, but the question on boundaries is, do you need to do it? And does it feel, is it serving you and feel good for you? Or does it feel like it's just another job that you have to check off? And if it's just another job you have to check off, you might want to look into like why that is. And is it because it's a boundary you didn't set, or is it because you're fatigued and you need to take a week vacation?
Yeah, and I think also your point, the second point on the slides, like who else can help? Because I know
Yeah.
that it's easy to feel like I'm the only one who can do this, or I can do it faster or better. I can get it done, whatever it is. But then thinking, well, is it my responsibility? Is there someone else who could do this?
Right.
And that it's not all on one person to do everything, which goes back to the beginning, the help our career part. Like,
Mm-hmm. Right. In Pittsburgh, it's, I do a lot of the perinatal loss therapy and counseling to support, but we have at least 3 really good support groups. We have 2 bereavement doula supports that we can have clients call them and they can kind of move through that. Like, we're not alone in this, even though it often feels like it. There are other people doing this work that we can kind of refer people out to and make sure people are getting the support that they need. And it is that like there are other people, and sometimes it's not a matter of professional support, it's a matter of just being supported and like peer support. um and where do we go for that, and what does that look like? And it's okay to be like, hey, I gotta go pick my kid up at school, if school existed. I'll call you back in 2 hours, or I have a time post bedtime at 8:30. So you're calling me at 4, yeah, but I'm on kid duty until this time. And that's okay to do.
yeah, thank you. It's good stuff.
um the next section, I wanted to talk about post-traumatic growth a little bit. Again, this is related to a helper's career. And it's getting to know yourself, right? Getting to know most of us that are moving and living with bereavement and perinatal bereavement. You get really acquainted with the waves, and you get really good at knowing what the waves look like, and knowing that when the waves come, you just need to take time. You can't rush them, you can't hurry them up and move through them. You just need to be like, I'm out for the day. I need to go, cry in bed or go for a run or do whatever. But we understand that the waves come and they come over us, and they might feel like they're going to smother us, but they leave. They always leave. And we know that we're strong and we're stronger, and it passes. And for a lot of people in health and careers, it's really getting acquainted with your grief and becoming friends with your grief, and becoming friends with that fear, and figuring out how it can roll over you, and that it always comes and it always goes. And your job is to learn to kind of swim. The metaphor I often use is that grief is like an ocean, is like the ocean, and you never tame the ocean, you just learn how to swim it. When you first jump into the ocean when you're little, it takes you down and you probably almost drown, right? Over and over and over again. And eventually you just learn to swim. But even the best surfers sometimes get taken down by the waves, and that's just the way it is. But they always come up because they learn how to move through it. And that's really what grief is, and that's what we're kind of supporting families with, but that's also what you need to learn how to support yourself with. If you're in this for the long haul, secondary trauma is going to happen over and over and over again. And it's not something to fear, it's something for you to learn how to maneuver and become friends with, so that you can just let it kind of roll over you.
That's a beautiful analogy.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one that I use all the time. And that it's okay to get a life preserver if you're drowning. And that's the equation with meds, right? It's okay to get meds. If we need meds, we need meds. If you're drowning, you cannot learn to swim. You need a life preserver. So Tarana Burke is the founder of the Me Too movement. And one thing that she acknowledges she would like everyone to know about the Me Too movement is that it's not a victims movement. It's not a movement to punish people. It's a survivors movement to show growth, and to let people know that they're not alone. And that's how I feel about those of us that are navigating and survivors of perinatal loss on the other end. Like, it's not a victims movement. We don't want pity. We don't want, woe is me, you poor thing. I don't want to walk into a room where there's professionals and psychiatrists talking about perinatal loss and it's met with this deep pity and heaviness. I want the acknowledgement that this is a survivors movement. We have survived and we have moved through it, and there's post-traumatic growth on the other end. And that happened because that actually happened to me, that I went to a conference with a whole bunch of perinatal mental health providers, like the leading psychiatrists in the country, outside of the country. And anytime they talked about perinatal loss, it was met with this heaviness and this grief. And like everyone in the room went, oh, about the family. And I just was there like, no, we don't want that. We want research, and we want people to figure out what to do to support people, and we want help. We don't want othered. We don't want told that it's on this other end and like, oh, poor them, and pity. We want empathy, and we want change, and we want people to do better at prevention, right? But anyways, post-traumatic growth. It's positive change experienced as a result of a struggle or a major life crisis. That's traumatic event. There's new sense of opportunity, deeper relationship, increase in your own strength, and greater appreciation for life. But it's not binary. It's not like you get there. It's not like an end point. It's a constant journey, and you constantly will move through it, and you'll have the waves that take you down, and then you'll kind of come back up. Pain and suffering coexist with post-traumatic growth, and that is the thing that, as we're moving through and supporting families, that we're moving towards. The goal of grief and trauma work is to decrease the intensity, the duration, and the frequency, which means to decrease how much it hurts, to decrease how frequent it happens and to decrease how long it lasts. And so in the beginning, when you're in that room with a family that's moving through the waves of perinatal loss, in the beginning, it's going to feel really intense and they're going to last really long. And as they kind of move through, it'll take, weeks to months, but the ultimate goal to years is to get to that place where you're moving through it and you feel it coming, but it isn't as intense and it isn't as frequent and it doesn't last for days like it did in the beginning. So that's the goal for grief work if we're looking at. This is just a couple stuff from option B that talks about resilience and what that looks like. She just talks on the idea of personalization, how we view it as a failure. So as providers, are you viewing whatever happened as a failure? Pervasiveness, the belief that what you're feeling in this moment is going to spread to all aspects of your life. It's going to impact everything. And then permanence, the belief that it's going to last forever. It's never going to move through. Whereas people that get really good at resilience and really good at grief and trauma work and moving through that, they understand that it doesn't last forever. It just comes and goes. It's fluid. This is one of my favorite quotes, compassion. So if we're talking about compassion fatigue, understanding that compassion is knowing our darkness well enough to sit in the dark with others. It's not a relationship between the wounded and the healed. It's a relationship between equals. And that's it. I think I made it on time.
You did.
Yay. That's uncommon. I'm going to go back to the quote because I like the quote.
I love the quote too. Thank you for that. So if anyone has, we have about a little bit less than 10 minutes. If you have questions, put them in the chat box and we will talk about them.
Yeah, and if you want to do it to just all panelists and you want it like a private question, we don't need to read your name. Or just Kylie or just me. So someone said that my slides look beautiful. They are Canva slides. And I do love them and I use them all the time now.
Yeah, we love Canva.
Oh, all right. So one question that was to everyone. Examples of boundaries that folks have that are working well and maybe some language you use to communicate boundaries. Can I ask for clarification if you're communicating boundaries with families you're working with or colleagues? All, okay. So with colleagues, I mean, part of it depends on like the situation that you're in. But one thing that like I have simply done during COVID is put on my email thing that everyone's working different hours and I don't expect people to respond to me immediately. I don't expect or want people to respond as soon as they send me an email or as soon as I send them an email, just like I don't expect the same from them. And that's something that I've kind of set as a boundary. As well as I don't try not to go to people with like urgent things that make them feel like it's urgent. On the other end, in terms of boundaries, like if you're a nurse or an OB and what that looks like part of your job is being on call for those, whether you work 12 hours or 24 hours or like you're set. And I think making sure that like while I'm here, this is when I'm here, but I'm taking my breaks at these times when I can and the family's not like actively in it. And when I'm not there, I'm only reading my email or I'm only checking in like at this specific amount of time and like really making a conscious choice to set almost that like visual boundary of like, this is when I'm working and this is when I'm not. Even if it's in the middle, you know, as clinicians, I think it's just important to give, like, if someone's having an emotional crisis, or whatever that looks like, the question is always safety. First and foremost, if it's a safety crisis, then it's a safety crisis and we need to check in. But also maybe there is someone else you can call to hand it off to. Is there a supervisor you can hand it off to? Is there a colleague? Is there a crisis network within your community that you could hand it off with? Could you just send them to the emergency room and kind of hand it off and be like, I'll check in a couple hours? And I think it's also about respect. Like when families understand that you set these boundaries, they're learning how to respect you and your time. One simple reframe is thinking of boundaries as you are teaching colleagues and families and people how to work with you, instead of you just leaving them guessing. Like if you give them clear direction of like, this is when I'll get back to you and this is what I'm doing, everyone feels safer in that environment because they know what to expect. And so think of it rather than I'm setting a selfish boundary for me time, of I am teaching people how I expect to be treated and how I expect my time to be respected. And usually they'll do it because they understand. When you set a boundary because you're pissed off that they already crossed it, I think that's a different thing to work through. But if you set a boundary as this is what I need and how I work, then people work within that.
So can I'm
Do you
gonna
have any other
ask
thoughts,
you,
Kylie?
well, I'm gonna just ask another question, a little bit more from somebody specific to like labor and delivery. So she's asking, I'm curious to know what you recommend that practitioners do in real time. So like, let's say the doctor, nurse, midwife is at hour 2 of a 12-hour shift. They have a patient with a fetal demise. What do you suggest for them to do for themselves during the rest of that shift other than just survive? And what do you recommend they do for the rest of the week? Navigating a loss. Like,
So yeah. So in that situation, I think I would join the family. Like I would join, like it's okay to show up and be present with the family through what they're going through, and that there will be tears and you will have emotions, and I think it's fine to go to the break room and cry, and I think it's fine to go do what you need, but there's a point of like, can you give yourself permission to go do those things and to cry and give yourself 5 minutes to just sob and then show back up? And that might happen multiple times throughout it. I don't know about Kylie, but most conversations I've had with people with demises, they know that their staff is crying with them. They've seen their staff cry. They've seen their staff be present in that space with them because it's heavy emotions. And if someone is showing up with you in that space, you would expect that to happen. And so in that moment, I would say find time to give yourself permission to feel, and then figure out what you need to regulate and kind of move through it. I do not I do not think it's okay if the family feels okay and they're not actively sobbing in that moment for you to then just start sobbing in that. And there's a difference between a couple tears and a sob of your story is so terrible and it's making me cry, right? There's a difference between that empathy piece and sympathy. And so checking in on that, and they feel different from like a couple of tears that are coming down because it's sad versus that visceral experience. And then the rest of the week, I mean, get sleep, drink your water, go for a walk. Do you have anyone? Do you have a supervisor you can process with? Journaling. What do you need to kind of move through that space? Do you have colleagues that you can process with?
and then, okay, I will ask one more final question before we go here. So this person is asking, our organization offers peer support. Some of my team members struggle with boundaries. What's a good way for me to begin helping them set boundaries with the families they serve? Trainings, tips, techniques, communication.
Um, trainings, tips. I mean, to be completely honest, I think the first place I would go would be to kind of like Brene Brown stuff. She talks on boundaries, but she talks on like vulnerability and resentment, and how resentment is almost always a lack of boundaries on our part. If we're feeling resentment towards someone else, it's usually because we should have had boundaries. And so but there's also that point of us setting boundaries is us being vulnerable, because it's us saying what we need and what we want, which, as anyone in the helping profession, we're not trained to do that. And so I think that might be a place that I would look at starting, is some of Brene Brown's work and what that looks like, so you can kind of navigate that path. But then in terms of like, I think it's all individual, right? So like, some people respond to emails and return calls at 6 o'clock in the morning. Some people do it other times, but I think it's about saying like, this is when I'm on and this is when I'm not. And just giving them permission, if how many hours a week do they want to be working, and what are their on hours, and when are they not on? And they might not always get calls during those on hours, but I think just that in general, of saying like, this is when I'm on and you can feel free to call, and I'll try to call you back within the hour, or whatever that might be. It's just when we decide for peer support or something like that, that we're on 24/7, that doesn't work for anybody, because your peer supports then leave because they're not getting the time that they need. And again, then they're not supporting more families because they're leaving earlier. And so just setting that, and if they need more, then you can offer as a peer support. In my mind, that always means they just need more intervention. It means that they need more than you're offering of peer support, and that's okay. Right? As clinicians, if a client needs to see us more than twice a week, they need a higher level care. And it's not because we're failing, it's because they need a higher level care. And so I think looking at that, like, what does that mean and how is that okay? And that might just be the culture of the organization too. It starts at the top.
Yeah, and then what's also coming to mind is in the workplace, like beginning to talk about these things, begin to talk about normalizing secondary trauma, defining it, what is it, talking about boundaries, talking about self-care, so that but that can be really hard, if you're one person trying to make these changes and you're not management. So okay, that's a whole nother conversation.
It can be hard, but right. And if there's one person within that's starting out their career and they look to you as a mentor, even if you're not changing the whole system, you're supporting that one person to stand in what they need and to advocate for what they need. So I think it's that, like, right, like, we can be angry at the big system that's not changing, or we can try to change a couple people at a time, and support a couple people to feel heard and validated, and to know that then when they get above you, because that's kind of the goal of when you're supervising, is that people are going to move past you eventually, then they're going to already have a mentor that like honored boundaries and said this, and they're going to know what that looks like, right? It's again that ecosystem of, yeah, you're not helping at the higher ups because they're probably mostly white men, that whatever, but you're helping these people that might end up in that position eventually. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of my thought.
Okay, we are past time, and I just want to be really respectful of everybody's time, because I know that you're working. And so Jodie, thank you so much for agreeing to come on again and talk about these important topics. And thank all of you for being here, for taking time for yourself to learn about how do you better care for yourselves and then the families that you support. So I want to leave with a couple of things. Number one, all of our webinars are now free of charge to anyone who wants to watch them, whether they're current or past, but we do rely on donations. We are a nonprofit organization. So if anybody could donate $5, $10, $20, anything, if you found today to be helpful, that would be really helpful to us as an organization so we can continue to keep putting out this kind of content. And secondly, if you have any further questions, thoughts, ideas, topics that you'd like to explore, if we did another one of these, please put them in the chat box and we will take note of those. So thank you so much for being here, and have a beautiful day.
Thank you, everyone.